Hello and welcome to this session of supply chain management. This is session number 1, module 1, and it is meant to be an introductory overview session so that we get a basic idea as to what supply chains are all about, and let's look at the agenda for this session. So we are going to answer some of these questions. What is a supply chain? And why do we need supply chains? Do supply chains serve any purpose? Which they surely do, but we need to understand what are the core purposes that supply chains serve. We are also going to now, after that, ask ourselves that having understood what supply chain is, what is managing supply chain? So what is supply chain management vis-a-vis our understanding of supply chain? And then, of course, the logical question, what is the goal of supply chain management? And then we end the session by looking at some of the critical decisions which fall under the purview of supply chain management. Good. So let's get started. What is a supply chain? To answer this question, let us go through a hypothetical example. I have here broadly the map of India, and if you can see this point here, this represents a source, a supply source. Let us say it is a plant, a production factory. So basically, it is a source of supply. And as we can see, this source of supply, it is a single source of supply, and it is located towards the southern region of the country. We also see on the same map that if you can see the red dots, which are fairly distributed all over the area of the country, those red dots represent points of consumption, which means that they represent the points locationally, geographically, those points where consumption of the product is happening. Which product? The product being produced by the plant, which you can see at the bottom. Okay? So essentially what we are saying is that here is a situation where you have a single source of supply and you have hundreds of points of consumption or points of demand spread geographically all across the country. Okay? So what is the challenge? The challenge, of course, is that whatever is being produced at the plant needs to reach all these hundreds of points of consumption or the markets for the customers to purchase and consume those products. And essentially, that is the role that supply chain is going to fulfill. Okay, so how is the supply going to happen? Well, one option, a fairly simple one, is what you see now on the screen, where the arrows And we have drawn only a few representative arrows here. The arrows represent the flow of material or the product from the source to points of consumption or points of demand. Okay? So, that is clearly one option that we have, which is called, let us say, it is called direct supply. Direct supply from source to points of consumption. Okay, now what is the problem? Is there any problem with this configuration of supply? Yes, indeed. There is a big problem. And the problem is that the sheer distance that needs to be covered in order to fulfill all the demand across the length and breadth of the country, that distance is going to be humongous. And therefore, the cost of covering that distance, so we are talking of cost here, and the time it takes to cover that distance, because we are talking of the lead time of, let's say, transportation here, all of that is going to be fairly high. Okay? And therefore, what we are saying is that this particular configuration of meeting the demand through direct supply from the source is not a very effective nor a very efficient configuration of supply. And therefore, what options do we have? So, perhaps we could look at a solution like the one you see on the screen. Now, in this option, what we have is, we have created two facilities. Let's call these two facilities our warehouses or distribution centers. And look at what is happening. Now, all supplies from the plant are going straight to this DC or distribution center or this distribution center, okay? And the distribution center then supplies two different demand locations. Now, we have shown only two distribution centers. You could have more number of distribution centers. How many exactly do we need to have is something that we will study later in other topics within this course, but we'll have to wait patiently for that. Right now, all I can say is that this configuration is far more effective and far more efficient than what we had in the last screen. And the reason why is, let us try and understand that. We are saying that look at the total distance. Now, the total distance has reduced because the total distance is the distance from the plant to one of the distribution centers plus the distance from the distribution center to the retail outlet, okay, which is far less than so many hundreds of direct distances from plant to retail outlets. Okay, so definitely the total distance traveled has gone down. Okay, and so has the cost of transportation. So efficient, yes. Is it more effective? Oh yes, it is far more effective because now if you store inventory of the product at these distribution center and that inventory is used to meet these demand, you can understand that the time it takes to meet the demand using the inventory in the distribution center is far less than what it was taking in the previous configuration. And therefore, this configuration is not only more efficient, it is also more effective in terms of the time it takes in meeting the demand. Good. So, therefore, what what we are basically trying to say here is that a supply chain essentially consists of multiple levels of these facilities, these, let us say, different parties, uh, which collectively uh, transfer the goods from the source to the final point of consumption and essentially to the final customer. Okay, so that is what we mean when we say when we talk of a supply chain. Now, why is it needed, or what is the role? Oh, by the way, I'm sorry I missed out on this. Now, this is the third scenario. It is identical to the second scenario. The only difference is that the blue squares that you see are the raw material or the component suppliers, and therefore the arrows that you see here are directed towards the plant, whereas the black arrows are directed out of the plant. And I got the component suppliers into the scene simply to emphasize the fact that there are multiple levels, the multiple players who are involved, who collaborate, who partner together to reach the final product into the hands of the customer. And that essentially is the role that the supply chain plays. Okay, so there you are. We have a schematic diagram of a supply chain, and we start with, so let's say this is a bicycle manufacturer. Now it has got suppliers on this side. Okay, now this side typically is what we call upstream. Okay, whereas this direction is downstream. Okay, now these are suppliers who are supplying various components and parts to the bicycle manufacturer. The bicycle manufacturer assembles those parts into bicycles, and then of course we have the wholesalers or the distribution centers or whatever, and then you have the retailers, and then the customer, of course, walks into the retail outlet perhaps and takes away the bicycle that the customer wants. Okay, so what is to be noted here is essentially a few things. The first is that it is a multi-layered, multi-level configuration. The second thing is that you might observe that the product manufactured here is reaching the customer through multiple channels, So you have a direct channel to the customer. Maybe this is an online sale of bicycles that is happening. Of course, the product is reaching the customer through the retail outlet. Okay, so essentially what we are saying is that there are multiple channels through which you can reach out to the customer. Each has its own pros and cons, and we will again look at some of these pros and cons as we move along in the course. More formally, like I said, all stages involved, directly or indirectly, in fulfilling a customer request. Okay? There are a couple of things important here. The supply chain includes your raw material suppliers, your manufacturers or plants, your distributors, your transporters, your warehouses, retailers, and the customers. So what is important to understand here is that the customer is a part of your supply chain. Okay? The second thing which we need to understand is that if you consider an organization within the supply chain, you will have material coming into the organization from the suppliers. You will have products flowing out of the organization into the market to the distributors, wholesalers, etc. Now, sometimes we may be thinking that, the supply chain is this part and this part, but whatever is happening within the plant is not a part of supply chain. If you think that, I'm sorry, that is not the case. So what we have to understand is that the supply chain very much includes all the operations, all the processes taking place inside the plant in order to fulfill the customer request. Okay, this is something interesting. On the screen we have 4 different kinds of products, very, very different from each other. And looking at these, one might think that, these products are so different from each other, surely the supply chains would be very, very different from each other as well. And these are just 4 products. Just imagine we have hundreds of thousands of different kinds of products being made, produced, and sold, consumed globally. And therefore, you can imagine how many different kinds of supply chains we might need for fulfilling the requirement of reaching those products into the hands of the customers. Now, the question is that really so? Okay, now, let us look at these products and try and find out if we can identify some similarities among or between any of these products. For example, if you look at the mangoes here and the fashion product at the bottom right corner, there's something common between the two, and that is that both these products are perishable. Okay? Perishable means that there is a certain period in time during which these products are so-called fresh. If you go beyond that period of freshness, these products are no longer useful or that valuable to the customers. Okay? So therefore, although they are extremely different in nature, mangoes and fashion, but they do share this characteristic in common that both are perishable. Okay, what else? Both mangoes and the fashion products are sold directly to the customer. Oh, what I mean is the final consumer. Okay? Whereas, if you look at the other 2 products, you find the one at the top right corner is an automobile air conditioner part. Okay? Now, that part, which is called the compressor of the air conditioner, is typically sold to an OEM buyer, like an auto manufacturer who would be using that part in assembling the air conditioner for the car. Similarly, the bags of cements are in all likelihood directly sold to construction companies or real estate companies who are going to use those in building houses. So, therefore, we do find some similarity, we do find some ways of classifying the products, into products that are sold directly to the end consumer and products which are sold to companies or organizations which are going to use those products in further making something. Okay, good. Let us look at sourcing. And when we discuss sourcing, talk of the mangoes and the cement. Now, the sourcing of mangoes cannot happen just from anywhere. After all, there are regions where mangoes are grown, and if you have to source mangoes, you will have to go to those regions for sourcing those mangoes. Similarly, a cement plant cannot be constructed just about anywhere. The cement plant has to be close to the raw material sources that are used for making the cement. And therefore, for both the mango as well as the cement, what we find is that the sourcing location is restricted, is constrained by certain factors. On the other hand, if you look at a plant that is manufacturing the compressor of an air conditioner, or a factory which is manufacturing fashion clothes and accessories, you can locate these factories or plants anywhere that you want to or you wish to. There are no hard constraints in their location. Okay, so therefore what we are saying is that although there are multiple different products existing in this world, the supply chains may have certain characteristics which are common, and therefore it helps us to exploit those commonalities and classify the commonalities in a way so that we can study them far more effectively. Okay, so that is what I wanted to communicate using this slide. Yeah, so why do we need supply chains? By now I think it would be very, very clear that we need supply chain for a very, very basic purpose, and that is to help the demand and supply meet each other, as you can see on the slide. Now, you might be thinking, why is it a big deal? Why is it a big deal? Why is it so difficult to match the demand with supply? Well, there are various reasons for that. Fundamentally, we are saying that demand is uncertain. Uncertain demand. So we are talking about, what? Demand for what? So essentially we are talking about variety or choice given to the customer. Okay? And the moment you have variety, which one of those choices will be exercised by the customer cannot be known for sure until the choice has been exercised. We are talking about the quantity, how much you have a product available at a retail outlet. Now, how much of that product will get sold in a certain period of time, let's say in half a day or in 1 day, is something which is variable. We have absolutely no control or we cannot determine that quantity for sure. Okay? When, which is related to time. Similarly, as we were discussing about the quantity, time is also a variable in the sense that you may have inventory of a certain product, but how soon that inventory and at what rate will that inventory get consumed, we do not know. That is also uncertain. Okay? And then finally we are talking about place. The demand is distributed geographically, and when we say distributed geographically, we are saying that there is a demand here and there is a demand here and here and here, spatially, and these demands are uncertain. So today the demand at point A may be a certain level. Tomorrow the demand at A may be something else. Whereas at B it may be at a certain level which is similar to what was at A, and therefore what we are saying is that place also is a variable which introduces variability in the demand itself. Okay, so essentially we are saying that the demand is uncertain. you know the supply, on the other hand, has to satisfy all the above demand characteristics. Okay? So, for the supply to satisfy or meet all the demand characteristics, obviously it's no easy task. And therefore, we are also asking, well, we will meet the demand. Okay, it may not seem to be so difficult to meet the demand, which is so uncertain, by carrying a whole lot of inventory of whole lot of different variety at whole lot of different places. But the question is, at what cost are you then meeting the demand? Okay, so these are some of the variables with which we are going to grapple during the course as we move along. Okay, some very simple aspects of supply chain. Essentially, a supply chain represents flow. And of course, the most prominent flow is the flow of goods or the flow of material from the source to the final customer. Okay? And therefore, we say that the goods flow is primarily downstream. Okay? That is the direction of flow of goods. Well, if goods flow downstream, then something must flow upstream as well, and that is money. The goods are exchanged with money. So if your supplier supplies you something, what the supplier receives from you is payment. So goods and money essentially are moving in opposite directions. A third and one of the most important flows across the entire supply chain is the flow of information. And what kind of information? What role does this information play? So, at a very, very simple level, we are saying that if this is a retail outlet, the retail outlet has to give information about the requirement of products to the supplier. Now, this is called orders. So, the retailer has to order certain products, certain quantities at certain times from the supplier. And this order, of course, is an information. Okay? Without this information, the supplier cannot supply. So, this information, the order information, is flowing from the retailer to the supplier. Well, there is something which is flowing from the supplier to the retailer back, and that is also information, and that is also a very important information. It is called the status of that order. Okay? The status means that, okay, I need this quantity by this time of this product. So the supplier should be able to tell that, yes, we will be able to fulfill your requirement, and having promised that, we should be able to track that order over a period of time to see what is happening to that order in reality. And tracking of that order essentially is information which is flowing back from the supplier to the retailer. And therefore, what we are saying is that information is something that flows in both directions, and it has to. So, having discussed what is a supply chain, What purpose does it serve? We now come to a very fundamental question, and that fundamental question is, what is the goal of a supply chain? Okay, and the goal of supply chain or supply chain management is to maximize what we call the overall supply chain surplus. Okay? Now, what is supply chain surplus? The supply chain surplus is equal to the customer value minus all the costs incurred in creating that customer value. Okay? Now, what value does the customer perceive from a certain product or a service for that matter is of course dependent on the perceptions and expectations of the customer, but there is certainly the notion of the value being perceived by the customer. Okay? And the customer pays precisely because of that, because the customer sees value. Okay? So therefore, what we can say is that if we take the price to be an indicator of the value perceived by the customer, then we can say that the supply chain surplus is basically equivalent to the overall supply chain profitability, because we are saying it is customer value minus all the supply chain costs, which is like saying, a surrogate for value is price, and price minus all costs. So we come to the notion of profitability. And so in a way, we are saying that we want to maximize the overall profitability in the supply chain. Okay? Is there a problem in doing that? Let's look at a very simple example. We are saying that a customer purchases a certain item, in this case a wireless router, from a certain retailer at a price of $60. Okay? Now, you must understand that the customer pays $60 to Best Buy, and this is the only input, financial input or money input into the supply chain. Okay? All the flow of money that we saw happening in the upstream direction, all the flow starts from the customer who is paying for whatever the customer is buying. Right? And therefore, in this case, the $60 is the only money inflow into the supply chain. Okay, what happens to that? The supply chain cost, there are multiple players who have participated together to bring that product, the router, into the hands of the customer in this case. And all these players need to be compensated for their efforts from that $60. Okay? And therefore, there are supply chain costs. And the $60 has to account for all the costs, not for just one player, the cost of the entire supply chain. It has to account for that. And once we take that cost out of the $60 of inflow, we are left with the overall supply chain surplus. And the supply chain surplus from $60, I don't know what it is. For the moment, let's just assume that it is, let's say, $10 in this case. Now, that $10 has to be distributed amongst all the players in the supply chain. And the problem arises here. The problem is that how do you distribute the supply chain surplus across all the players in the supply chain, because in real life situation, players would tend to dominate. The bigger the player would tend to keep more share of that money or the surplus, and therefore create all kinds of conflicts. Okay, and this is what happens in supply chain management in real life. Now, why are we bothered about that? There is a very, very big reason. And the reason is that we will see later in the course that if one player in the supply chain tries to maximize his or her share of profits, then the overall supply chain profitability goes down. Okay? So, as supply chain managers, our goal is to maximize the overall profitability of the supply chain, not the profitability of one player. We must remember that. Okay, so now we come to the final phase of this module. We need to take a brief look at the kind of decisions encountered by supply chain professionals or managers in the field, and these decisions can be classified into three categories, as you can see on the screen. The first category we call the supply chain strategy or design related decisions. The second one is supply chain planning related decision. And finally, the supply chain operation related decisions. The way we have classified into these three categories is basically the horizon over which the decision is taken. Okay, so for example, the first set of decisions, the supply chain design or strategy related decisions, essentially involve a few years. So you are deciding something which is going to impact the business a few years down the line and for a few years therefrom. Okay, so these are long range, long term decisions. Supply chain planning related decisions are medium term. The maximum period that these decisions might have an impact in could be a year or a few months. Okay, so we are looking at that kind of planning horizon. And of course, the supply chain operation is more related to here and now, the day-to-day, the week-to-week kind of decisions that need to be taken in the supply chain. So let us look at some examples of these decisions just to clarify what these are. The first one, the supply chain design. Imagine this is the set of decisions which you are going to encounter when you are designing the supply chain, which means that the supply chain hasn't yet been created. You are actually trying to configure the supply chain. And imagine what kind of decisions will you be taking in such a case? Well, not very difficult to imagine, I suppose. We are talking about, what kind of products are we going to make and which markets are we going to sell those products in? That's a very, very fundamental decision which will decide how you configure your supply chain. We are also talking about the locations of our facilities. The facilities are, our plants, our warehouses, our distribution centers, or retail outlets. We have to decide about their location, and not just the location, we also have to decide about their capacity. Okay? We also then have to decide about what mode of transportation are we going to use primarily for transporting our products in the supply chain. Is it going to be the sea or the ocean route, or is it going to be the land route? If it is land, is it going to be the train, or is it going to be the truck or the road transport? All of that has to be decided for your supply chain, and those are long range, long term decisions. Similarly, we are talking about what kind of information systems do we use, how much investment do we need to make into establishing those information technology and information systems. Remember, I had said earlier, information plays a very, very critically important role in the management of supply chains. Okay, so that decision is a big decision that you need to take. And of course, we're also talking about the sourcing. Are we going to have multiple sources? Are we going to have less number of sources but very strong relationship with our suppliers? Where are these sources going to be located? Do we need some kind of collaboration with a vendor globally, because the vendor might have certain capability which we do not have but is required in making the final product? Those are the kind of decisions that we are going to encounter in this phase, which is called the strategic phase or the design phase. Now, what is typical of this phase? Look at any of these decisions and you'll find that once you have taken a decision and started implementing that decision, it is very, very difficult to change it later. Okay, and therefore one has to be very careful before taking these decisions. Okay, so that's the long range. Let's come to the time horizon, much shorter, the medium term, a few months, maximum 1 year. Remember, in this case, we already have the supply chain in place, unlike the previous case. Here, the supply chain is already there. It has been configured. Now, within the constraint imposed by the existing supply chain, we have to decide a few things. Okay? For example, we already know what products and what markets we are engaged in, but now we are talking about what is the demand going to look like in the next few months. The forecasting is very, very important because that helps us in planning our capacities for meeting that demand. Okay, so we are talking about demand forecast. We are talking about planned buildup of inventories. Remember, our supply chain is a multi-layered supply chain. So therefore, we may need to plan our inventories, how much, where, geographically, locationally, time wise, SKU wise. We need to plan our inventory distribution. We are talking about some kind of backup plan or subcontracting in case we need that because we fall short of capacity during a certain phase or a certain period when the demand peaks, and so on. We are talking of inventory policies. There are market promotions, advertisements. These are the kind of things that we are planning to influence the demand of the product. Okay, so all these decisions are taken in this particular planning phase. And then, of course, we come to the third or the last phase, the supply chain operation phase. And here, the time horizon is a week maybe, or even a day. And what kind of decisions do we need to take during a week or a day? Well, there are customer orders, or there are orders coming from maybe a distribution center, and we need to plan our manufacturing, we need to plan our production, and we need to plan our resources basically. Our resources are the equipment which is used for producing the product, the resources are the labor which maybe works on those equipment to produce the product, and most important resource is the time. So we are talking of equipment or the capital, the labor, and the time. These three resources have to be planned, their allocation. In what way are we going to prioritize the use of these resources so that we are able to meet our schedule? There is a schedule of production that needs to be followed so as to meet the customer final demand. Okay, so that essentially constitutes the kind of decisions which need to be taken in this phase. Well, that brings us to the end of session 1, module 1. We call that the overview of supply chain management.